Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War I by Epic History. Now I've got the full series pulled up, the hour-long version, as this is the most recently edited version they've put out, but I'm going to be reacting to it in parts and breaking it down as they did originally. So today we'll be watching part 1, which is the year 1914. We're doing each year as we go. You know, this is one of their big series from the past, and I've also wanted to do more World War I content on the channel, so I'm excited to get into this one. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. July 1914. Europe goes to war.
1914. The great powers of Europe are divided into two rival alliances. The Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia, united by fear and suspicion of Germany, Europe's new strongest power. And the Triple Alliance, Germany, which fears encirclement by its rivals, Austro-Hungary, clinging on to a fragile empire, and Italy, seeking gains at French expense.
And surely all of these countries and empires will still be standing once this war is over. It'd be crazy to think that one, or even more than one of them, could fall through the course of this conflict.
The spark comes on the 28th of June in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist.
Right, we're sort of really jumping into the conflict here. It's worth giving a bit of background information to understand how exactly we got here, right? So this war doesn't spring out of nowhere. Of course, we always start with this assassination, but let's be honest, if Europe wasn't a powder keg already, if tensions weren't incredibly high, this would not have led to a wider conflict, right? It only does because there has been growing tension, nationalism, militarism for years leading up to this, right? Now, you could go back, frankly, decades. You know, following the Napoleonic Wars, there had been this concert of Europe system where the European powers had tried to negotiate and speak with each other, act diplomatically before it came to blows, before warfare started. And that had been a relatively successful system. It hadn't prevented all warfare between them. But as you headed towards the latter years of the 19th century, particularly as you had the unifications of Italy and especially Germany, tensions had begun to rise. Right? Germany comes onto the scene, this new unified country. Immediately, it's very powerful. Right? It's one of the European great powers. But it doesn't necessarily, or it feels like it doesn't get treated fairly by the other European powers as sort of a newcomer to the club. Now, it's sort of strange, right, because it was made up of a lot of countries that had been part of the European political scene, Prussia most notably. But the new Germany feels that they're not being treated fairly. They're not being brought into the colonization game, for example. And so they in particular, but this is a trend that would be mirrored by a lot of powers, not just in Europe, but around the world, looking at you, Japan, would begin to build up their military in order to expand their territory and threaten the imperial territory of those countries around them, right? So tensions were growing and growing and growing. Of course, in response to that, particularly from Germany, other countries like Britain, they began to build up as well. And these countries began finding allies. Britain actually allies with Japan, right? May seem like a strange alliance at first, but they had some interests in common, right? So militaries are built, alliances are forged, and tensions begin to grow, right? And this wasn't the first time these tensions had erupted, right? Russia and Japan actually go to war, which leads to major upheaval in Russia, a revolution. It doesn't quite overthrow the Tsar, though, right? So just to point out, we've been really building up to this point. Tensions are high. Everyone's ready to explode and go to war, using a lot of those big militaries they've been building, these new weapons they've created with brand new technology, right? Everyone's sort of raring to go.
Named Gavrilo Princip, Austro-Hungary accuses its Balkan rival Serbia of having aided the assassin and sends an ultimatum demanding
Which they did. The Serbian government was most certainly involved.
humiliating concessions. Serbia rejects the ultimatum, and Austro-Hungary declares war. Within hours, Austrian forces are shelling Belgrade. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, feels honor-bound to defend Serbia, a fellow Slav nation, and orders the Russian army to mobilize.
And this is where we get those alliance systems coming in, right? So Austria gives Serbia this ultimatum. Serbia essentially has no option but to refuse. To accept would be a massive blow to its sovereignty, right? Austria knows they're not going to accept. What Austria basically wants to do is quickly go to war with Serbia and pound them into submission. However, because of these alliances that have been built and because tension is so high, other European powers begin to get involved, right? Most notably, Russia and Germany. Now, there's sort of a whole thing associated with this. We've done some reactions to Extra History series on World War I, where you see, especially between the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, who were related. They were cousins. A lot of the European monarchs were related. They were talking back and forth, and they didn't really want to go to war with each other, but they both wanted to step up and defend their ally, right? Russia's ally being Serbia, Germany's ally being Austria. And so they basically force themselves to the edge, and then they go over, right? They can't stop this process.
German Emperor Wilhelm II has promised his support to Austro-Hungary. He and his generals see conflict with Russia as inevitable, and the sooner the better, as Russian strength grows year on year. Russian mobilization is used to justify German mobilization, followed by a declaration of war on Russia.
Right, you can see this sort of escalation as everything continues, and there's this idea, especially among the Germans, the German high command, that Russia is this underdeveloped, lumbering giant that will take ages to get into the war. Now, there's truth to that, but they also sort of underestimate Russia in this initial phase. Now, like I said, there is some truth to that. Russia is this giant country. Throughout the war, it begins to find itself sort of outmoded a little bit by some of the other participants, and Russia in particular, its government is crumbled by this conflict. But, it's not necessarily what it's stereotyped to be. Russia does manage to respond more quickly and forcefully than Germany, for example, thinks it could.
Russia. Germany knows war with Russia means war with Russia's ally, France. It has developed the Schlieffen Plan to meet this threat of a war on two fronts. First, its armies will advance rapidly through neutral Belgium to encircle and destroy French armies near Paris and win a quick victory. Then its forces can move east to deal with Russia, whose huge army will take much longer to mobilize.
Right, so first of all, you can see how through these alliance systems, more countries get involved. Austria and Serbia bring in Russia and Germany. Russia then brings in France. Going through Belgium brings in Britain. All of a sudden you've got a world war. You can also see how the German strategy, it relies on the fact that Russia won't be able to respond quickly. And if they do, the Germans, they're in a lot of trouble.
And so Germany declares war on France. 6 million men are now marching to war across Europe. Italy, however, remains neutral. The terms of the Triple Alliance don't bind it to join an offensive war.
Yeah.
The United States also declares its neutrality. President Wilson and the American public have no desire to get entangled in Europe's war.
Yeah, and these two are worth pointing out, right? Italy, who was integrated into this alliance system, sort of takes a step back and says, we don't really want to get involved. Now, as we know, they will play a role later in the war. Same thing with the United States. Now, the United States is far less entangled in this European system of alliances, and it's not really interested at this time in being entangled. And so it says, we're not getting involved. There's also far less a sort of moral imperative with World War I versus the Second World War, right? These are two very different conflicts in some ways. And so the US is like, nah, we're not really interested. But, of course we know the US will get involved, first in a non-military capacity and then in a military capacity. We also know, this time especially, late 1800s into the early and mid-1900s, is when the United States really emerges as a great power on the world stage, especially through their industrial and economic capacity. And this conflict, and the next, is a big part of that.
Britain is France's ally, but at first it's not clear if it will join the war against Germany. But when German troops invade Belgium, whose neutrality Britain has guaranteed, an ultimatum is sent from London to Berlin, demanding they withdraw. It's ignored, and Britain declares war.
August 1914. All right, here we go.
A British expeditionary force lands in France, while the German invasion is held up for crucial days by Belgian resistance at the fortress city of Liège.
Yeah, so the Germans are already encountering problems they didn't necessarily expect, which is, look, Belgium's a small country. They do not possess the military or industrial might of some of their neighbors, but they put up more of a fight than Germany expected. The German army is unexpectedly slowed down in Belgium, and so they're not advancing nearly as quickly as they expected to.
German troops commit several massacres against Belgian civilians. The atrocities are inflated by Allied propaganda and help turn public opinion in neutral countries against Germany.
Yeah, and so this is one aspect of the war, the sort of propaganda war that's going on, right? Waged on both sides. But in the propaganda war of World War I, Germany in particular finds itself to be a loser. Now, like I said, you look at the First War versus the Second World War, there's obviously a much clearer imperative in the second, right? It's not hard to see why you should get involved to stop the Nazis from committing the Holocaust. Now, this one, it's a little less clear, Now, Germany is often painted as sort of the aggressor, but I'd argue there's a lot of blame to be thrown around for World War I. Right? There was a lot of aggression and militarization among a lot of these countries. However, the propaganda warfare, like I said, Germany finds itself portrayed quite negatively in a lot of neutral countries. Particularly this matters in the United States. Now, there was mixed opinion, right? There were a lot of German Americans, but the US finds itself inundated with a lot of British propaganda in particular, depicting the Germans as these violent brutes, depicting the war crimes, some of which they did commit, and also some of these inflated war crimes, making it seem even worse than it already was, but there were legitimate atrocities committed. No, not just on the Germans, of course, but those are the ones that are being depicted in the propaganda, and opinion does begin to turn against Germany. Like I said, I'm talking about the US in particular, but this is a trend that goes beyond the United States and a lot of countries around the world.
France, unaware of Germany's great encircling attack, launches Plan 17, an offensive into German territory. But in the Battle of the Frontiers, they're driven back with enormous losses on both sides. The British Expeditionary Force clashes with the German army at Mons, but the British are heavily outnumbered.
And I will point out, of course, a lot of countries have theoretical plans to defend themselves from an invasion or invade a country they may think hostile. That is true, but I'll point out that essentially all the countries involved here have very actionable invasion plans for their neighbors, especially Germany. And when I say actionable, I mean immediately actionable, as in the lead up to this war, even before the spark of that assassination went off, Germany was essentially saying, hey, or at least some of the German high command, they were ready to go to war. And a lot of politicians and military leaders throughout Europe had these plans ready to go, and they intended to seriously use them at some point, right? So it wasn't just theoretical. People were really building towards this conflict. Now, it may not have gone down the way they expected, but they were waiting for some type of conflict to erupt.
And soon join the French in retreat. The Allies make their stand at the River Marne, 40 miles outside Paris. Their desperate counterattack saves the city and drives the Germans back. Both sides suffer 250,000 casualties.
Jesus.
The race to the sea begins as both sides try to outflank each other to the north. A series of clashes leads to the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies desperately cling on and prevent a German breakthrough. There are more heavy losses on both sides. The two armies then dig in along the entire 350-mile front, seeking shelter from deadly machine gun fire and artillery shells.
And this is where we begin to really see World War I as we recognize it, right? This race to the sea, where both sides race as quick as they can, and then they meet, fight, and dig trenches, and they really get themselves dug in, right? And this sort of trench warfare, it's not the entirety of the war, you know, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but it is a big part of World War I, is this sort of very stationary and very brutal style of trench warfare.
Trench warfare has begun.
The war at sea. Let's get naval.
British warships win the first naval battle of the war at Heligoland Bight, sinking 3 German cruisers. Britain has the most powerful navy in the world, 29 modern battleships
For
to
now.
Germany's 19. They now impose a naval blockade on Germany, preventing contraband goods, including food, from reaching it by sea. The aim is to bring Germany's economy to its knees and force it to surrender. But a week later, the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder becomes the first victim in history of a lethal new weapon, the submarine-launched torpedo.
Keep an eye on those. They'll be playing a big part of this conflict. And keep an eye on, we're talking about the war at sea, keep an eye on civilian and commercial shipping, right? That'll be a big part of this too.
German submarines, or U-boats, have a surface range of 9,000 miles and can attack undetected from beneath the waves. They herald a deadly new challenge to Britain's command of the seas.
True. Yeah, this is a new era of naval warfare, and it really is. I mean, everything is changing. Britain has been and sort of remains the master of the seas. I mean, that's how it's built its empire. But we've got these new technologies, new dynamics are at play. It is a new era, and everyone's going to have to work that out as they go. The Eastern Front. Back to Russia.
On the Eastern Front, Russian armies invade East Prussia, but they blunder into disaster at the Battle of Tannenberg, where General von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff, mastermind...
Keep an eye on those two. They might be important through this conflict and beyond.
brilliant German victory, taking 90,000 prisoners and destroying an entire Russian army.
Damn.
The Russians contribute to their own defeat by transmitting uncoded wireless messages. A second massive German victory at Masurian Lakes forces the Russians into retreat.
I will say there are incredible levels of casualties throughout this conflict, but if you really want to see where, you know, massive amounts of people are being killed or captured at once, look at the Eastern Front. It's indescribable, honestly.
In just 6 weeks, the Russian army suffers nearly 1/3 casualties.
Jesus.
Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary's invasion of Serbia suffers a humiliating reverse at the Battle of Tser. Austro-Hungary's offensive against Russia also ends in disaster and...
It is funny because Austria-Hungary, like I said earlier, frankly, what they really wanted was to punish Serbia for their suspected involvement in this assassination. They wanted to go to war with them and sort of beat them up a little bit, right? But the war started, and it's not going very well for Austria. They're struggling with Russia. They're even struggling with Serbia. So they're not having a good time.
Retreat, with the loss of more than 300,000 men. The fortress town of Przemysl is cut off and besieged by the Russians. The Germans are forced to come to the rescue, launching a diversionary attack towards Warsaw.
Another common theme we'll see throughout this conflict, the Austrians getting into trouble and the Germans having to come to the rescue.
It leads to weeks of brutal winter fighting around the Polish city of Łódź, but there is no clear winner. Meanwhile, the Turkish Ottoman Empire has joined the Central Powers, declaring war on its old enemy, Russia. Turkish warships bombard the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol.
Yeah, it's 1914, so the Ottoman Empire has essentially been through more than 100 years, and I do mean more than 100 years, of declining territory and influence, and they've lost a lot of that to Russia in particular. Now, throughout sort of the late 1700s into the 1800s, especially 1800s, and then into the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire has lost the vast majority of its territory. Now, a lot of that is to revolutions and uprisings, but their sort of main foreign adversary is Russia, which keeps pushing southwards into their territory, taking more of it, and encouraging those revolutions and uprisings, and supporting them wherever they can, right? So the Ottomans have got a real bone to pick with the Russians. Now, we talked about empires that won't survive this conflict, right? Austria-Hungary, Russia. The Ottomans are another example. Their empire will not survive this war.
While in the Caucasus, Russian troops cross the Turkish frontier.
The world at war.
Beyond Europe, the war rages on the world's oceans and in far-flung European colonies.
Right, this is really why it's called a world war, because at this time, Europe has essentially colonized the world. Like I said, this is taking place in 1914. We've gone through an intense era of European colonization, right? Through, of course, prior to the 1800s, but especially intensifies in the mid to late 1800s when a lot of Asia and Africa is conquered by these imperial powers, and that makes this war worldwide, along with all of the new technologies that have come into play, technologies that allow you to, of course, travel and make war around the world, but also communicate around the world, right? So this is really a globalized conflict. Other conflicts in the past had been worldwide, something like the 7 Years' War, but this was truly unprecedented in its scale.
German troops cross into British East Africa, modern Kenya, and occupy Taveta, while Allied forces seize the German colony of Togoland, modern Togo. But British forces invading German Cameroon are defeated at Garoua and Nsangakong, while a 3,000-strong force attacking German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, is captured at Sandfontein. A month later, British landings at Tanga end in chaos and defeat at the hands of a much smaller German force led by Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck. Cut off from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck goes on to wage a highly successful guerrilla war against the Allies, tying down huge numbers of troops. In Asia, Japan honors its treaty with Britain and declares war on Germany. Japanese forces go on to seize the German naval base at Tsingtao.
Yeah, and we're seeing, there was fighting around the world. I talked about how Germany, as a sort of new great power, had felt a little offended that it hadn't been getting the respect it felt it deserved. One way that materialized was through imperialism, right? Germany wanted more imperial territory. It felt it should get better imperial territory. And so this is sort of an opportunity for them to fight it out in Africa and for Britain or Germany or France to take more of that territory that they all wanted. Now, Japan sort of has similar thoughts going through its head, where it gets involved, it honors its treaty with Britain, right? Like I said, they were allies. But Japan has been very focused on expanding its imperial empire at this point, right? That is essentially why they go to war with Russia in 1905. Both countries are trying to expand their sphere of influence, and Japan has an eye towards expanding their colonial possessions as they enter this war, right? So that's going to be front and center for them the whole time. Now, as the war continues, for a lot of these countries, sort of survival becomes the number one priority. And the colonialism drops down the list a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still on the list. And especially when the war wraps up, all these European powers will go back to trying to grab everything that they want. But for some countries, like Japan, that is still their sort of number one goal.
The German colonies of Samoa and New Guinea surrender to troops from New Zealand and Australia. But in the Pacific, off the coast of Chile, German Admiral von Spee's powerful East Asia squadron sinks 2 British cruisers at the Battle of Coronel. Both ships are lost with all hands.
Damn.
5 weeks later, he runs into a British naval task force at the Falkland Islands. 4 of the 5 German cruisers are sunk. Von Spee goes down with his flagship. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British troops seize control of the Ottoman port of Basra, securing access to the vital Persian oil that fuels the British fleet.
All right, winter 1914.
That winter, Austrian troops finally capture Belgrade. But the Serbs then counterattack and drive them back once more. The fighting in Serbia has already cost around 200,000 casualties on each side.
Damn. And, of course, you think about the numbers in absolute term, right? Because these are massive numbers of people being lost. But also, if you think about them in terms of the proportion of each country's population, you know, for a small country like Serbia, does not have a lot of people to throw into this conflict, you know? So if you look at the percentage of people lost, a country like Serbia is going to suffer greatly. All the countries involved will suffer greatly, right? And like I said, the absolute number is massive, especially in some of these bigger countries. But proportionally, this war is devastating for a lot of countries that get involved.
In the North Sea, German warships mount a hit-and-run raid against English coastal towns, shelling Hartlepool, Whitby and Scarborough, and killing more than 100 civilians.
I mean, this is, of course, sort of deeply concerning and offensive to Britain, who, you know, it's this island. Well, you've got the British Isles, of course, Britain and Ireland. But, you know, they tend to see themselves as pretty separate from the rest of Europe. They've developed this navy to defend themselves from attacks on their territory, right? The Brits are not very used to fighting or being attacked in their country. Now, you know, this war and the next one, they're going to get used to being attacked or being bombed. But, you know, this is something that is like, whoa, what the hell's going on? We're actually getting attacked in our homes. This is, you know, not normal for us.
On the Western Front, the French launched their first major offensive against the German lines. But the First Battle of Champagne leads to small gains at a cost of 90,000 casualties.
And another common theme we'll see throughout this entire conflict, we'll see these massive battles and assaults launched. You've got hundreds of thousands of people involved, and you have casualties in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, but very little tends to be gained, right? Maybe a little bit of territory, the front line is pushed a little forward or backward, not much gained for massive levels of casualties.
While in the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive through the mountains in midwinter ends in disaster at Sarikamish. Turkish casualties total 60,000, many frozen to death.
Yikes.
On the Western Front, that first Christmas is marked in some sectors by a short truce and games of football in no man's land.
Yeah, this is a relatively famous moment from World War I, where sometimes you have truces between both sides. They come together, they play some football, they have Christmas celebrations amongst each other. I believe a lot of these celebrations would cease as the war continued, as it dragged on, and people felt the brutality of it. But this sort of highlights, and I think people use this to highlight one of the main, narratives about this war, which is this is a war that really didn't gain anyone anything. You know, this is a war that was essentially created by the higher-ups of Europe whether military or political, because of these rising tensions, this desire to gain territory to prove themselves against these other great powers. But it's the people of Europe that pay for it, right? All these millions of men sent out to fight, all the many who died, they weren't the ones making the decisions, right? And we see at the beginning of the conflict, they may have been willing to celebrate Christmas and play football with the other side. But they were the ones sent out there to die, even though it was their commanders making the calls, right? So that's one of the narratives you'll see about World War I. And it also sort of fits in with the style of combat here, right? We have trench warfare. We have this style of warfare we'll see where you just keep throwing men into the meat grinder, right? Like I said, extremely high casualties for extremely low gains, right? So that's sort of something to think about as we go.
The killing zone between the trenches.
All right, and that is the end of part 1, which is 1914. Like I said, I'm breaking it down like they did in their original series, so they essentially break it down by year. I'm just using this because it's the most recently edited version. I want to stay up to date with this sort of stuff. So we're going to end this one here. We'll come back next time with 1915. So yeah, that was a real fascinating episode. It's sort of a bit of an older series by Epic History, but they always do a great job. This is, I think, one of their sort of popular, well-known series they've done throughout the history of their channel. So I'm glad to finally get to it. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.